London, January 1944. In the underground bunkers of Amiens 6 headquarters, intelligence officers sat in grim silence as they reviewed the latest dispatch from occupied France. The mood was as cold as the January air, seeping through the thick basement walls. Behind 3 feet of stone at Amiens Prison, 120 men were awaiting execution, scheduled for 6 a.m. on February 19th. Among them were men who knew too much, including the date of the Normandy invasion. The prisoners were not ordinary criminals. They were members of the French resistance, and 2 American OSS officers and 1 British MI6 agent were among them. These men held knowledge of Operation Overlord, the structure of the resistance network, and details that could unravel months of careful planning for D-Day. The Gestapo knew what they had, and they were willing to extract every secret through torture before the final bullet. Amiens Prison is not just a building, read one MI6 report from that January. It is a grave where the living are buried. Behind those 3-foot-thick walls are men who know the invasion date. From inside the prison, the message that reached London was even more chilling. The condemned men, facing inevitable torture and death, had sent word through underground channels. If you must save us completely. But if that is impossible, better a bomb than torture and execution. They were asking to be killed by their own side rather than face what the Gestapo had planned. The Germans had already begun their grim work. 12 prisoners had been executed in December 1943 and January 1944. Rumor had it that the Gestapo shot 1 person per day, deliberately torturing the remaining prisoners with knowledge of their approaching doom. Raymond Vivant, leader of the OCM, or Organisation Civile et Militaire, one of France's largest resistance networks, had already endured 3 days of continuous torture. In the prison's basement, whispers spoke of an interrogation room where prisoners could hear the screams of those being tortured, a psychological weapon designed to break spirits before bodies. Time was running out, and conventional rescue was impossible. The 832 prisoners crammed into Amiens Prison represented a cross-section of occupied France's most wanted. But only 100 to 120 were condemned for helping the Allies. These were the ones the Gestapo wanted most, the criminals of freedom who had dared to resist. At the center of this network was the OCM, a massive intelligence organization directly linked to Allied invasion plans. When its leader, Raymond Vivant, was arrested in autumn 1943, the entire northern France resistance structure began to crumble. The man who brought them down was Lucien Pierry, a shopkeeper from Amiens who had been secretly informing for the Gestapo since 1941. His network of informants had destroyed dozens of agents, and now he had delivered the biggest prize of all. The operation was not simply about saving prisoners. It was about preserving a critical intelligence network that would coordinate the resistance during the Normandy invasion. Losing the OCM and its leaders would mean failing to use the French resistance as a 5th column during the landings. The consequences would be measured in Allied lives lost on D-Day beaches. Among the condemned were ordinary people who had done extraordinary things. Some had sheltered Allied pilots shot down over France. Others had transmitted intelligence about German defenses along the Atlantic Wall. A few had sabotaged railways and bridges. Their crimes were acts of courage, and their punishment would be death unless something impossible could be accomplished. Group Captain Percy Charles Pickard was the wrong man for the job, and everyone knew it, including Pickard himself. At 28 years old, Pickard was already a legend in the RAF. He wore the Distinguished Service Order with 2 bars and the Distinguished Flying Cross. He commanded RAF Hunsdon and had become a household name thanks to the 1941 propaganda film Target for Tonight, where he piloted Wellington Bomber F for Freddy. Shot down over France in 1940, He had escaped German captivity within 2 months, proving his combat spirit and resourcefulness. But there was a devastating problem. Despite his extensive experience with strategic bombing, Pickard had only 10 hours of experience flying at rooftop height. The mission would require flying at 50 to 100 feet above ground, threading through French villages and power lines. Bombing a target with surgical precision while German gunners fired at point-blank range required immense skill. 10 hours of training for that kind of flying was nothing. It was barely enough to understand the physics, let alone master the art. The mission was supposed to be led by Air Vice Marshal Basil Embry, a master of low-level flying who had personally designed the attack plan. But just 2 days before the operation, Embry was pulled from flight duty. He had been appointed as one of the D-Day coordinators, and High Command forbade him from risking his life on combat missions. The job fell to Pickard at the last possible moment. On the morning of February 18th, 1944, at 8 a.m., just 4 hours before takeoff, Pickard received his briefing alongside the other crews. He was learning about the target, the approach, and the stakes for the first time. One of the navigators carelessly mentioned special circumstances during a phone call to his girlfriend days earlier. The call was intercepted by military censors, and Pickard had publicly reprimanded the entire crew for loose talk and carelessness in a mission demanding absolute secrecy. When Pickard entered the briefing room that morning, some of the experienced pilots did not immediately recognize him as their commander. One pilot later recalled that they saw an officer with medals and thought he was some general. They did not know this was Pickard, and that he would have to do the same thing as them, but with 10 times the responsibility. The aircraft assigned to Pickard carried the call sign F for Freddy, the same designation as his Wellington in the 1941 propaganda film. It was pure coincidence, but it would become symbolic. February 17th, 1944. The weather forecast was catastrophic. Dense clouds, blizzard conditions, visibility under 100 meters. The operation was postponed for 24 hours. That evening, RAF Meteorological Services reported a potential window, a brief clearing that might last 2 to 3 hours around noon the next day. It was now or never. If they did not fly on February 18th, the execution scheduled for February 19th at 6 a.m. would proceed. At 10 a.m. on February 18th, RAF Command made the decision. 18 Mosquito bombers and 1 photo reconnaissance aircraft would launch immediately. On the ground at RAF Hunsdon, the temperature was -8 degrees Celsius. Visibility was 50 meters, and fresh snow covered the runway. Flight Lieutenant John Broadley helped Pickard into his flight suit. It was the last time anyone would see them alive. Within 5 minutes, EU-19 aircraft lifted off into the blizzard. One by one, they vanished into the gray murk. Ground crews could not see anything beyond the end of the runway. 4 Mosquitoes lost visual contact with the formation in the clouds and turned back, deciding it was better to abort than to get lost over the English Channel and crash into the sea. One aircraft suffered engine failure over the channel and limped back on a single engine, making an emergency landing at RAF Biggin Hill. The remaining aircraft pressed on through conditions that would have grounded any mission under normal circumstances. But this was not normal. Behind them, the clock ticked toward February 19th, 6 a.m., execution time. As they crossed the channel, pilots flew barely 30 meters above the waves. The weather was so severe that one pilot later wrote that he could not see the channel itself, just gray mist. He was not even sure it was behind him. Pilots radioed each other, asking if this really made sense when they could not see 50 meters ahead. The response was curt. "Can you see the ground below you? Then fly. 2 squadrons of Typhoon fighters were supposed to provide cover over France. RAF. West Hampnet was so buried in snow that the base commander initially refused takeoff clearance. When the Typhoons finally launched, they went without external fuel tanks, meaning they could stay over the target for only 10 to 15 minutes. Of 16 expected fighters, only 6 made it to the rendezvous point over the French coast. Ironically, the blizzard saved the mission. German FW-190 fighters at Abbeville and Évreux could not take off in the conditions. If the weather had been clear, the Luftwaffe might have intercepted the bombers before they reached Amiens. One pilot from No. 4 87 Squadron later remembered coming out of the clouds and first seeing land. He was shocked because there was a French village right in front of him. He was flying exactly 50 meters off the ground and could see faces in the windows of houses. Amiens Prison was built in 1866, a classic French prison with thick stone walls. 3 feet of solid masonry that could stop rifle fire and dampen the screams from within. By February 1944, it had become a Gestapo fortress. The structure consisted of 2 wall systems, an outer wall 6 meters high and an inner wall surrounding the main building. Between them were 2 guard posts with machine gun positions. The Germans had recently reinforced the garrison from 30 guards to 80, with additional machine gun nests in the courtyard. A ground raid was impossible. French resistance fighters had considered it and rejected the idea as suicidal. The key targets were the eastern and northern walls, which separated the prisoner cells from the outside world. If bombers could breach these walls precisely, prisoners could escape through the gaps. But the guards' barracks also needed to be destroyed to eliminate armed resistance during the escape. To prepare for the mission, RAF Hunsdon constructed a full-scale plaster model of the prison. Pilots practiced flying around it at 50 feet. During training, one pilot misjudged his approach and crashed into the model, suffering a concussion. The incident demonstrated how precise the flying would need to be, and how fortunate he was that it was not the real prison. Dominique Ponchardier, leader of the local resistance, had sent detailed blueprints of the prison to London, including guard schedules and photographs. This intelligence allowed RAF planners to calculate exact bombing angles and explosive power. There was a dark rumor about the Gestapo conducting mock executions in the courtyard every day between 11 a.m. and noon to demoralize prisoners. The raid was timed for precisely that window, when guards would be expecting another routine execution, not an air attack. Behind the prison lay open fields where resistance members would wait on bicycles and in cars, ready to evacuate escapees to safe houses in the countryside. The de Havilland Mosquito FB Mark VI was unlike any other aircraft in the war. With a top speed of 415 miles per hour, it was powered by 2 Rolls-Royce Merlin 25 engines, producing 1,610 horsepower each. Armed with 4 .303 caliber machine guns and 4 20mm cannons, it could carry up to 2,000 pounds of bombs. But what made the Mosquito truly unique and uniquely vulnerable was its construction. The fuselage was built from wood and plywood, not metal. This made it incredibly light and fast, earning it the nickname Wooden Wonder. It also made it extremely fragile against anti-aircraft fire. A single 20mm shell could shred through its wooden frame like paper. The 18 Mosquitoes assigned to Operation Jericho carried 36 men, 18 pilots, and 18 navigators. Most were young, averaging 25 to 27 years old. Many had never flown a combat mission at such critically low altitude. The force was divided into 3 squadrons. No. 4 87 Squadron RNZAF, the Royal New Zealand Air Force. 3 aircraft were assigned to strike the eastern and northern walls. Among them was pilot Merv Derall, flying with navigator Fred Steve Stevenson. The two would remain lifelong friends after the war. Flying Officer Sparks from No. 487 Squadron would later suffer engine damage and wounds, but somehow managed to fly back to England on one engine, making an emergency landing at RAF Ford. No. 464 Squadron RAAF, the Royal Australian Air Force. This was the main striking force, tasked with demolishing the prison walls and guard barracks. This squadron had earned a reputation for precision bombing in recent months. No. 21, Squadron RAF, the Executioners. If the first two waves failed, No. 21 Squadron would obliterate the entire prison, killing everyone inside, prisoners, guards, and escapees alike. Not a single pilot in this squadron knew about this role until the final briefing. One pilot from No. 464 Squadron later recalled the weight of the mission. He said that when they got the briefing, he understood this was not just a bombing run. This was the last resort before the end. If they did not hit the target, people would be executed tomorrow morning. The pressure was enormous. 12:01 p.m. The first wave of No. 487 Squadron RNZAF screamed in at 50 meters altitude, engines roaring, wings level. The pilots could see individual German guards turning to look up, rifles still slung over shoulders. For a frozen moment, nobody moved. Then the first bombs fell. The initial 500-pound bombs struck the eastern wall exactly 5 feet from the ground. The massive stone barrier, 3 feet thick and built to last centuries, simply exploded. Blocks of stone weighing hundreds of pounds flew through the air, raining down on nearby houses. The shock wave rippled through the prison complex. The second bomb hit the guards' barracks. A direct hit. The building disintegrated, killing most of the German garrison instantly. 50 German soldiers and guards died in those first seconds. 12:03 p.m. No. 464 Squadron RAAF attacked from different angles, 150 and 250 degrees, dropping 8 more 500-pound bombs on the northern wall. Giant breaches opened in the stone fortifications. Inside the prison, the experience was apocalyptic. One prisoner later recorded in his diary that he remained motionless, waiting for the explosions to end, thinking an air battle had occurred overhead. He thought some aircraft must have fallen with their bomb loads. But as soon as the dust cloud cleared, he saw that his cell door had been torn from its hinges. The long corridor that had been his prison, both floors of the building, a massive pile of stones, all were replaced by a smoking heap of rubble. The bombs used time delay fuses, detonating in waves. First explosion, 5 seconds. Second, 10 seconds. Third, 15 seconds. These successive shock waves literally pushed cell doors open, as if some invisible hand were throwing them wide. But precision had its price. 102 prisoners were killed in the bombing. Another 74 were wounded. The bombs did not discriminate between guards and prisoners. They just destroyed everything in their blast radius. Yet, even this terrible toll was considered better than the alternative: torture and execution by the Gestapo. One aircraft from No. 464 Squadron was observed bombing the target but never returned. The crew was either shot down or crashed due to battle damage. Their fate remains unknown to this day. 12:05 p.m. Group Captain Pickard's Mosquito circled the prison at 500 feet. From this altitude, he could see everything: the breached walls, the smoking ruins of the guard barracks, and most importantly, the prisoners. They were escaping. Men with faces blackened by smoke and explosion residue stumbled through the gaps in the walls, running into the open fields beyond. Some were limping, some were helping wounded comrades, but they were moving. The mission was working. Pickard faced the most critical decision of the operation. If he did nothing, Number 21 Squadron would arrive in 10 minutes and complete their orders. They would obliterate the entire prison complex, killing everyone inside, guards, prisoners, and escapees alike. That was the backup plan. If rescue failed, ensure no intelligence fell into German hands. But if he transmitted the success code, Number 21 Squadron would abort their attack. The escapees would have a chance. Pickard keyed his radio microphone and transmitted 2 words. Red Daddy, Red Daddy. The code for success. The signal to abort the final wave. The choice to save lives rather than ensure silence. Later, in German documents discovered after the war, an intelligence officer noted that at 12:05, one of the bombers circled the target and transmitted something by radio. FW-190 command could not intercept. This was the signal to cancel further attack. Pickard had seen the faces of prisoners escaping and made his choice. As one comrade later paraphrased, he saw their faces and people were getting out. He understood the operation was successful and there was no point in killing those who were already saved. The photo reconnaissance Mosquito filmed the entire attack, providing the only proof of success in the first hours after the mission. That film footage would later convince High Command that the impossible had been achieved. 12:08 p.m. Pickard turned north for the return flight to England. He was flying at 500 feet, slower than he could have been, because he had been observing the escape. 4 Fu-190 fighters from 7th Staffel had managed to take off from Abbeville despite the weather. Among them was Feldwebel Wilhelm Meyer, a young but skilled pilot hunting for targets. At a distance of 4 miles north of Amiens, Pickard heard a strange sound, the ripping canvas noise of cannon fire. Meyer had positioned himself perfectly under the Mosquito's tail and opened fire with a long burst. Bullets tore through the wooden fuselage. One shell struck the cockpit directly. Navigator John Broadley was hit in the head. Death was instantaneous. Pickard felt the impact, the sudden shift in the aircraft's handling. He tried to climb, tried to gain altitude and escape. But with Broadley dead and the Mosquito damaged, control was slipping away. The wooden wonder could not save him this time. The Mosquito lost altitude, spiraling down toward the snowy fields below. Pickard fought the controls all the way down, but physics and damage had the final word. The aircraft crashed in a field near the village of Saint-Gratien, 8 miles north of Amiens. Both crew members were killed on impact. French villagers found the wreckage and buried the bodies with respect. Meyer also shot down Typhoon fighter flying officer J.E. Renault on the approach to the target. Another Typhoon was lost over the sea, pilot missing. Total losses from the operation were approximately 6 to 8 men. After the war, a myth emerged that Pickard was shot down by the famous Josef Priller himself. This was not true. Meyer was a young Feldwebel in Priller's unit. But Priller became legendary later, and the story was rewritten over time, as myths often are. Lieutenant Waldemar Rodner, another pilot from 7th Staffel, later wrote that he saw one of the bombers circling at low altitude. He opened fire, but did not hit. Then Meyer went down and apparently succeeded. The bomber fell in a field nearby. Of the 832 prisoners in Amiens, 258 escaped. 102 were killed in the bombing, 74 were wounded. 472 remained in the prison and were later freed by advancing Allied forces. Of the 258 who escaped, 79 were resistance members and political prisoners, the ones the mission was designed to save. But approximately two-thirds, around 170 people, were later recaptured by Germans or betrayed by collaborators. Only about 85 remained free to continue the fight. Crucially, 12 people scheduled for execution on February 19th at 6 a.m. survived. 2 of them, an American officer and a British agent, made it back to England. Dominique Ponchardier and his resistance fighters waited outside the prison with bicycles, motorcycles, and cars. They divided escapees into groups and sent them in different directions to safe houses in the countryside. Many were sheltered by French farmers who risked death to hide them. In March 1944, Ponchardier sent a letter of thanks to London. He thanked them on behalf of their comrades for the bombing of the prison. He wrote that they could not save everyone, but thanks to the miraculous precision of the strike, the first bomb opened almost all the doors. He noted that 150 prisoners escaped with help from the civilian population. Of these, 12 were scheduled to be shot on February 19th. In addition, 37 prisoners were killed, some by German machine gunners, and 50 Germans were also killed. The strategic impact was even more significant. The freed OCM members helped identify more than 60 Gestapo agents and informants, devastating German counterintelligence in northern France. They restored the resistance structure in time for D-Day, allowing coordinated sabotage attacks on railways, bridges, and communications on June 6, 1944. This reduced the Wehrmacht's ability to rapidly reinforce German positions at the Normandy beachhead, potentially saving hundreds of Allied lives. Back at RAF Hunsdon, an anxious silence descended. Pickard and Broadley were not returning. Duty officers tried to convince themselves that maybe they had landed at another airfield, or maybe there was radio trouble. Days later, confirmation arrived. Pickard and Broadley had been buried by local French civilians in Saint-Gratien. Until September 1944, Pickard's status remained missing in action. Only after France's liberation was his status confirmed as killed in action. Details of the operation remained classified for nearly 30 years after the war. Officially, it was called Ramrod 564. The name Operation Jericho was not assigned until the 1960s. In post-war England, Pickard's image was slightly rewritten by propaganda. He was called the perfect commander, though in reality he had been uncertain of his abilities and barely had adequate training. This does not diminish his heroism. It simply shows that heroes come in different forms. One comrade's memoir captured it best. Pickard was a man who did not believe in himself, but believed in his people. When the final decision needed to be made, he did not hesitate. That was his greatest quality. Historians still debate whether Operation Jericho was necessary or worth the cost. Who requested the operation? The official version says MI6 and OSS requested it because of the 2 intelligence officers in prison. An alternative version suggests resistance leader Dominique Ponchardier proposed the idea. The truth is unclear. Likely it was a coordinated decision. Did the escapees matter? Supporters point to the 60-plus Gestapo agents identified by freed resistance members. Critics note that most escapees were recaptured, making the overall impact questionable. Could there have been a ground raid? No. Germans had reinforced the garrison just a week before. A ground assault would have resulted in massive casualties. Air attack was the only option. Was Pickard's life worth the result? This question remains open. One historian wrote that Pickard sacrificed his life for people who probably would have been shot anyway. Was this sacrifice necessary? We do not know. Operation Jericho was a typical example of a high-risk operation with unclear outcome, characteristic of wartime decision-making. Its success is evaluated ambiguously, even 80 years later. Operation Jericho demonstrated that low-level precision bombing was possible. RAF subsequently used this experience to bomb Gestapo buildings in occupied France and Belgium. In July 1944, after D-Day, a similar operation was conducted against Gestapo headquarters in Bonneuil-Matour. The restored OCM network played a key role during the Normandy invasion. On June 6, 1944, resistance members launched coordinated sabotage attacks that hindered German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. For the French resistance, the operation was symbolic proof that their struggle mattered to the Allies. For the RAF, it demonstrated the combat readiness of the 2nd Tactical Air Force before the main operation of the year. Today, memorials stand in Amiens and at the former RAF Hunsdon base. Every February 18th, a memorial service is held in Amiens, attended by British and Australian veterans. The BBC filmed a documentary about the operation in the 1960s using authentic film footage. Books appeared after declassification in the 1970s, including entries in Osprey Publishing's Air War series. Some stories never made it into official reports, but survive in memoirs and oral histories. The photo reconnaissance Mosquito filmed the entire operation, providing the only proof of success in the first hours. Navigator John Broadley was not just a passive crew member. He calculated the optimal trajectory across the channel, minimizing flight time and fuel consumption. His navigation expertise allowed 9 of the 14 aircraft to reach the target. The full-scale plaster model at RAF Hunsdon saved lives. When one pilot crashed into it during training and suffered a concussion, it demonstrated how precise the flying needed to be, and how lucky he was it was not the real prison. One escapee, who was recaptured later, agreed to work for the Germans, providing information about resistance routes and hiding partisans. After the war, he was tried in France as a traitor. There exists an unconfirmed legend that Pickard wrote a final letter to his wife before the operation, beginning with the words, "If you receive this letter, it means I did not return." The letter was never found in archives, but the story lives on in oral tradition among RAF aviators. Operation Jericho is today considered one of the boldest precision air raids of World War II. It is taught in military academies as an example of a high-risk operation that succeeded through precise planning and crew courage. The operation proved that impossible missions sometimes succeed, not because of perfect planning or overwhelming force, but because ordinary people choose to act when the stakes are highest. Pickard had only 10 hours of low-level flight training. The weather was catastrophic. The target was surrounded by civilians. The prisoners might be killed by the very bombs meant to save them. Every rational calculation said to abort. But Pickard and his crews flew anyway. They flew through blizzards over the channel. They flew at rooftop height through French villages. They dropped bombs with surgical precision on a target where meters meant the difference between rescue and massacre. And when Pickard circled the burning prison and saw men escaping through the rubble, he made the final choice: transmit Red Daddy and give them a chance. 258 prisoners escaped. 102 died. Pickard and Broadley never came home. The resistance networks were restored. German counterintelligence was shattered. And on June 6, 1944, when Allied forces landed on Normandy beaches, the French resistance was there to help. Because on February 18, 1944, men in wooden aircraft had given them that chance. The walls of Jericho fell not to trumpets, but to bombs delivered by men who believed freedom was worth dying for. Even when success was uncertain and the price was measured in lives rather than victories.